The morning sun had barely risen over Lordsburg, New Mexico, when Flora Daniels realized her entire life had shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces, leaving her kneeling alone at the altar of the small wooden church where she was supposed to have become a wife. She had woken that April morning in 1878 with butterflies dancing in her stomach, her heart filled with nervous excitement about marrying Thomas Webb, the charming merchant who had courted her for 8 months with sweet words and promises of a comfortable life. Her younger sister Violet had helped her dress, lacing up the ivory gown their mother had sewn before she passed 2 years prior. Violet had seemed quieter than usual, but Flora had attributed it to emotion, perhaps sadness that their mother could not be there to witness this day. The first sign something was wrong came when Flora arrived at the church at 10 o'clock to find the pews empty except for a handful of confused guests. Her father had gone to check Thomas's boarding house, returning 20 minutes later with a face drained of all color. He pulled Flora aside, his weathered hands shaking as he gripped her shoulders, and told her in a broken voice that Thomas was gone. The landlady had seen him leave before dawn with all his belongings and a woman in a blue traveling dress. Flora's stomach had dropped like a stone into cold water because Violet had been wearing a blue traveling dress that morning, claiming she wanted to look nice for the ceremony. Flora had run back to their small house on the edge of town, her wedding dress catching on fence posts and dragging through the dust. She found Violet's room stripped bare, every possession gone, and a brief note on the pillow that read simply, "I'm sorry. He loved me first." The words made no sense. Thomas had never mentioned knowing Violet before he started courting Flora. But as Flora stood in that empty room, memories began clicking into place like puzzle pieces she had refused to see. The way Thomas always asked about Violet's whereabouts, the private conversations Flora had interrupted, Violet's sudden moodiness over the past weeks. They had been planning this betrayal, probably for months, and Flora had been too blinded by her own happiness to notice. She had walked back to the church in a daze, her father calling after her, but she could not hear him over the roaring in her ears. The few remaining guests had dispersed by the time she returned, unable to bear the weight of such public humiliation. Flora pushed through the wooden doors and walked down the aisle alone, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. She reached the altar where Reverend Matthews had been meant to marry them, and her legs simply gave out. That was where she found herself now, kneeling on the hard wooden floor, her face buried in her hands as sobs racked her body. She cried for the future she had imagined, for the betrayal of the 2 people she had trusted most outside her father, for the humiliation of being left at the altar in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. She cried until her throat was raw and her eyes burned, until she heard the church door creak open behind her. Flora did not turn around. She could not bear to face whoever had come to gawk at the pathetic abandoned bride. Heavy footsteps moved down the aisle, deliberate and slow, and then a deep voice spoke, rough as gravel but somehow gentle. "Madam, are you hurt?" Flora tried to answer but only managed a broken sob. The footsteps came closer, and then a large shadow fell across her. She finally looked up through tear-blurred eyes to see a man standing a respectful distance away, his silhouette backlit by the dusty sunlight streaming through the windows. He was the biggest man Flora had ever seen, easily over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the entire aisle. Long, dark hair fell past his collar, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. He wore buckskin clothing that had seen hard use, and a wide-brimmed hat dangled from one massive hand. Everything about him spoke of raw strength and a life lived far from civilization, but his dark eyes held an unexpected kindness as they took in her disheveled state. "I'm not hurt," Flora managed to say, though her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Not the way you mean." The man nodded slowly, as though he understood more than she had said. He glanced at her wedding dress, at the empty church, and his jaw tightened beneath his beard. "Somebody done you wrong?" It was not a question, but Flora found herself answering anyway. "My groom ran off with my sister this morning, before the wedding." The man's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering over the mountains. "That's about the lowest thing a man can do." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Name's Barrett Quinn. I came to town for supplies, heard crying when I passed the church, thought maybe someone needed help." Flora wiped her eyes with shaking hands, trying to compose herself even though it felt impossible. Flora Daniels, and I don't think anyone can help me with this particular problem. Barrett studied her for a long moment, then surprised her by lowering himself to sit on the edge of a nearby pew, making himself less imposing. Maybe not, but you shouldn't be alone right now, if you don't mind me saying so. Something about his straightforward manner, his complete lack of pity or judgment, made Flora feel slightly less like the world was ending. She managed to push herself up from her kneeling position, her legs trembling, and sank onto the pew across from him. Her wedding dress pooled around her like a white lake, mocking her with what should have been. "Do you live in Lordsburg?" Flora asked, desperate for any conversation that might distract her from the nightmare her life had become. "No, madam. I live up in the mountains, about 2 days north of here. Come to town maybe 3 or 4 times a year for supplies I cannot make myself." Barrett leaned back slightly, his massive frame making the pew look child-sized. "Mostly keep to myself up there, quieter than being around people." Flora could not imagine such isolation, though at this moment it sounded appealing. "Don't you get lonely?" "Sometimes," Barrett admitted, "but I learned a long time ago that being alone is better than being with the wrong people." His eyes met hers with sudden intensity. "Though I reckon that's not much comfort to you right now." Flora felt fresh tears threatening to spill over. Everyone in town will know by now. They'll all be talking about how Flora Daniels was not good enough to keep her own groom, how even her own sister wanted him more than she wanted to be loyal. Her voice broke. "How am I supposed to face any of them ever again?" Barrett was quiet for a moment, his rough features thoughtful. Then he said something Flora never expected. "You could leave." She blinked at him. "What?" "Leave town," Barrett repeated, as though it were the simplest thing in the world. "If staying here means facing all that talk and all those memories, you don't have to do it. There's a whole territory out here, places where nobody knows your name or your history." The suggestion was so outrageous that Flora almost laughed. "I cannot just leave. My father is here, and this is my home. I have nowhere else to go." "That's where you're wrong, Miss Daniels." Barrett leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "You can go anywhere you want. You're not tied to this place except by your own choice." Flora opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. The idea was terrifying and impossible, and yet somehow thrilling in a way she could not explain. But reality reasserted itself quickly. "Even if I wanted to leave, I have no money of my own. Thomas was supposed to provide for us. I've been helping my father with his accounts, but that barely keeps us fed." Barrett nodded slowly, understanding. "That does complicate things." He was quiet for another moment, then said, "What if you had a job somewhere else? Would you leave then?" Flora looked at him with confusion. "What kind of job? I'm not qualified for much beyond keeping house and basic arithmetic." "My mother lives in Silver City," Barrett said, the words coming out careful and measured. "She runs a boarding house there. Good woman, always treating her tenants fair. She's been looking for someone to help her run the place because her health is not what it used to be. I was planning to head there after leaving Lordsburg, see if I could convince her to take on an assistant." He met Flora's eyes directly. "You could come with me. I'd make sure you got there safe. And if my mother takes to you, you'd have honest work and a place to stay away from all this." The offer was so unexpected, so generous from a complete stranger, that Flora did not know how to respond. A dozen objections rose in her mind. She did not know this man. It would be improper for an unmarried woman to travel with an unmarried man. What would people think? But then she realized with a bitter laugh that people were already thinking the worst of her, and at least this way she would not have to see their pitying looks every day. "Why would you help me?" Flora asked quietly. "You don't know anything about me." Barrett's expression softened slightly. "I know you've been dealt a bad hand through no fault of your own. I know you deserve better than crying alone in an empty church. And I know what it's like to need a fresh start." He paused, then added, "My mother would treat you right, and I give you my word I'd be a gentleman on the journey. But I understand if you'd rather stay here with what you know." Flora looked around the empty church, at the altar where she was supposed to have married a man who had betrayed her in the cruelest way possible. She thought about facing her neighbors, about the whispers that would follow her everywhere in this small town. She thought about seeing the empty space where Violet should have been, the constant reminder of her sister's treachery. And she thought about Barrett's words. You can go anywhere you want." How long would the journey take, she heard herself ask. "About a week on horseback, maybe a bit more if we take it easy," Barrett replied, something like approval flickering in his eyes. "We'd stay at way stations or camp under the stars. I'd teach you how to handle the wild country so you'd not feel helpless." Flora took a deep breath, her heart pounding. This was madness. She had known this man for all of 15 minutes, and she was actually considering riding off into the wilderness with him. But the alternative was staying in Lordsburg, facing her humiliation day after day, watching her father's heartbreak over what Violet had done, and never escaping the ghost of what should have been. "I need to talk to my father first," Flora said slowly, "but if he gives his blessing, I'll go with you to Silver City." Barrett nodded, standing up from the pew with the easy grace of someone comfortable in his own strength. "That's fair and proper. Where can I find him?" "Our house is the small one at the east edge of town, near the dry creek bed," Flora said, rising as well, though her legs still felt unsteady. "But I should be the one to tell him. This is going to break his heart all over again." "I'll walk you there," Barrett offered. "Then I'll wait outside while you talk to him. If he wants to meet me before agreeing to anything, I'll answer any questions he has." They left the church together, Flora feeling oddly calm despite the momentous decision she was considering. The morning had turned hot, typical for April in New Mexico, and the dusty streets of Lordsburg stretched before them nearly empty. A few people peered out from behind curtains as they passed, and Flora knew the gossip about the mountain man escorting the abandoned bride would spread like wildfire. But she found she did not care anymore. Her father was sitting on their small porch when they arrived, his head in his hands. He looked up as they approached, confusion and concern crossing his weathered face as he took in the sight of Barrett. "Papa, this is Barrett Quinn," Flora said gently. "He found me at the church, and he's offered me a way to leave Lordsburg if you'll hear him out." For the next hour, Flora and her father talked inside their modest home while Barrett waited patiently on the porch. Flora explained everything, from Barrett's offer to her desperate need to escape the shame and gossip that would suffocate her if she stayed. Her father argued at first, worried about propriety and safety and all the things a father should worry about when his daughter proposes traveling with a strange man into the wilderness. But eventually, he seemed to see what Flora had already realized. Staying in Lordsburg would destroy her spirit piece by piece. He went outside and spoke with Barrett at length, asking hard questions about his intentions and his mother and what assurances he could give that Flora would be safe. Barrett answered every question with patient honesty, never defensive, understanding that he was asking this grieving father to trust him with his remaining daughter after the other one had just betrayed them both. Finally, her father came back inside and wrapped Flora in a tight embrace. "If this is what you need to do, I won't stop you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But you write to me from Silver City, you hear. Let me know you're safe and well." "I will, Papa," Flora promised, tears streaming down her face again, though these felt different from the ones she had cried in the church. "I love you. I love you too, little bird." He used his old nickname for her, the one from when she was small enough to sit on his knee. "You deserve to be happy. Don't let Thomas and Violet steal that from you." Flora packed quickly, trading her wedding dress for practical traveling clothes and stuffing a carpet bag with her few possessions. She braided her long auburn hair and pinned it up securely, then put on the sturdy boots she wore when helping her father with outdoor chores. By early afternoon, she stood in front of her childhood home with Barrett beside her, a borrowed horse saddled and ready. Her father hugged her one more time, then shook Barrett's hand with the grip of a man extracting a final promise. "You take care of her." "I will," Barrett said simply, and something in his tone made Flora believe him completely. They rode out of Lordsburg heading west toward Silver City and whatever new life awaited Flora there. She did not look back at the town where she had lived her entire 22 years, where she had expected to build a life with Thomas, where her sister had smiled and helped her dress for a wedding that would never happen. Instead, she focused on the road ahead and the steady presence of the mountain man riding beside her. Barrett set a reasonable pace, clearly mindful of the fact that Flora was not accustomed to long hours in the saddle. They rode through the hot afternoon, the landscape around them a mixture of scrubby desert plants and distant mountains. Barrett pointed out landmarks and explained the terrain, his deep voice a constant reassurance that she was not alone in this wild country. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Barrett guided them off the main trail toward a sheltered spot among some large boulders. "We'll camp here tonight," he said, dismounting with fluid ease despite his size. "There's a spring just beyond those rocks. Good water." Flora climbed down from her horse less gracefully, her legs stiff and sore from the unfamiliar activity. Barrett pretended not to notice her awkwardness as he began efficiently unsaddling the horses and setting up camp. Flora watched him work, fascinated by how competently he handled every task, from building a fire to preparing their simple dinner of beans and hard bread. "You do this often," she observed, sitting on a flat rock near the fire as darkness settled over the desert. "Most every day, up in the mountains," Barrett confirmed. He handed her a tin plate with food, then settled across the fire from her with his own. "It becomes second nature after a while." They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, then Flora asked, "What made you leave society and live alone in the mountains?" Barrett was quiet for so long that Flora thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I was in the war. Afterward, I came home and found everything I knew was gone. My father had died while I was away, my younger brother too. The farm we'd worked was seized for unpaid debts. My mother moved to Silver City to start over, and I tried to settle in town with her, but I couldn't bear it." He stared into the fire, his expression distant. "Too many people, too much noise, too many memories. So I headed into the mountains and found I preferred the quiet." Flora understood that need for escape more than she would have just yesterday. "Do you ever regret it, being so isolated?" "Sometimes," Barrett admitted, "especially when winter hits hard and I don't see another soul for months. But then I come to town and remember why I left, and I'm ready to head back to the high country." He looked across the fire at her. "What about you? Will you regret leaving Lordsburg?" Flora considered the question carefully. "I don't think so. I'll miss my father terribly. But the town itself?" She shook her head. "I think I would have regretted staying more than I'll regret leaving. Every street corner would remind me of Thomas. Every Sunday at church would remind me of Violet. I would have shriveled up inside." "Then you're doing the right thing," Barrett said with certainty. "It takes courage to walk away from what you know, even when it's hurting you." They talked late into the night, their conversation ranging from Flora's childhood in Lordsburg to Barrett's experiences living off the land in the mountains. He told her about tracking deer through snow, about the crystal-clear lakes that dotted the high country, about nights so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat. She told him about her mother's death, about learning to keep her father's books for his small freight business, about the dreams she had harbored of having her own family someday. "You'll still have that," Barrett said when she mentioned those lost dreams. "Maybe not the way you planned, but there's time yet for you to build the life you want." Flora wanted to believe him, though her heart still felt too bruised to imagine loving anyone again. She changed the subject, asking Barrett to teach her about the stars visible in the vast desert sky above them. He pointed out constellations and explained how to navigate by the North Star, his patient teaching making her feel less helpless in this unfamiliar environment. When they finally settled down to sleep, Barrett laid out his bedroll on one side of the fire and insisted Flora take the other side, placing his rifle within easy reach between them. "If you need anything in the night, you call out," he instructed. "Don't be shy about it." Flora lay wrapped in the blanket he had provided, staring up at the stars and marveling at how drastically her life had changed in a single day. This morning, she had been Flora Daniels, the merchant's bride. Tonight, she was Flora Daniels, a woman heading into unknown territory with a mountain man she had met only hours ago. It should have terrified her, but instead, she felt the first stirrings of something she had not expected: hope. They traveled for 5 more days through increasingly rugged terrain. Barrett proved to be exactly the gentleman he had promised, always respectful, always patient with Flora's inexperience in wilderness travel. He taught her how to read the land, how to find water, how to spot signs of animals or danger. He showed her which plants were edible and which were poisonous, how to build a fire that would not be visible from a distance, how to move quietly through brush without leaving obvious tracks. Flora absorbed everything like dry earth soaking up rain, discovering a capacity for frontier life she had never suspected. Her body grew stronger each day, her seat in the saddle more secure, her hands more confident with the tasks Barrett taught her. She began to understand the appeal of his solitary life, the way the wild country stripped away all pretense and left only the essential truths of survival and self-reliance. But more than the wilderness skills, Flora found herself drawn to Barrett himself. She watched how he moved through the world with quiet confidence, never boastful, but completely capable. She noticed how his rough exterior hid a thoughtful intelligence and a dry sense of humor that emerged in unexpected moments. She appreciated how he treated her as an equal, despite her initial helplessness, never condescending, always encouraging. On the fourth night of their journey, they camped in a canyon where wind-carved rocks created strange shapes against the sunset sky. They had talked for hours as usual, their conversations growing easier and more personal with each passing day. Flora had told Barrett about Thomas's courtship, how charming he had seemed, how thoroughly he had fooled her. "It was not your fault for believing him," Barrett said firmly. "A liar who's good at his trade can fool anybody. The shame is his, not yours." "I know that in my head," Flora replied, drawing her knees up to her chest as she sat by the fire. "But my heart still feels stupid for not seeing it." Barrett was quiet for a moment, then said, "You know what I see when I look at you, Miss Flora? I see someone who had the courage to trust, which is harder than being suspicious of everyone. I see someone who had the strength to walk away when staying would have been easier, and I see someone who's learning to stand on her own feet in country that would have broken a lesser person." He met her eyes across the flames. "There's nothing stupid about any of that." Flora felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "You're very kind to say so. I'm not being kind, just honest." Barrett poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for." That night, Flora lay awake for a long time thinking about Barrett's words. She thought about the way her heart had started beating faster when he looked at her with those intense, dark eyes. She thought about how safe she felt with him, even in the middle of the wilderness far from civilization. She thought about how his presence had become the most comfortable thing in her disrupted world. These thoughts should have alarmed her. It had been less than a week since Thomas's betrayal, and here she was developing feelings for another man. But these feelings were nothing like what she had experienced with Thomas. With Thomas, everything had been surface-level charm and pretty words. With Barrett, everything was solid and real, actions matching words, strength tempered by unexpected gentleness. Flora fell asleep that night with a question circling in her mind. Was it possible to find the right person in the midst of losing the wrong one? They reached Silver City on the afternoon of the 6th day, riding into a bustling town considerably larger than Lordsburg. Barrett guided them through streets busy with miners, merchants, and families going about their business. He led Flora to a well-maintained 2-story building near the center of town, with a sign reading, "Quinn's Boarding House," hanging above the door. A woman emerged as they dismounted, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 50 years old, with graying dark hair and eyes the same deep brown as Barrett's. Her face lit up when she saw her son, and she hurried down the steps to embrace him despite his trail dust. "Barrett, you're a sight for sore eyes," she said, her voice warm with affection. Then she turned those keen eyes on Flora. "And who might this be?" "Mama, this is Miss Flora Daniels," Barrett said, one hand resting protectively on Flora's shoulder. "She's had a rough time and needs a fresh start. I told her you might have work for her here at the boarding house." Barrett's mother, who introduced herself as Barrett Quinn, ushered them both inside and insisted they sit down for coffee and fresh bread while Flora told her story. Flora found herself spilling everything to this kind-faced woman, from Thomas's betrayal to Barrett finding her in the church to their journey across the territory. Catherine listened with complete attention, her expression shifting from sympathy to anger to understanding. When Flora finished, Catherine reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "My dear, you're welcome to stay here as long as you need. I do indeed need help running this place, and if you're willing to work, we'll sort out fair wages and accommodations." Relief flooded through Flora so intensely she nearly burst into tears again. "Thank you, Mrs. Quinn. I promise I'll work hard." "I have no doubt of that," Catherine said warmly. "Any woman strong enough to ride across the territory with my son has the grit needed for this business." Barrett stayed in Silver City for 3 days, helping his mother with repairs around the boarding house and teaching Flora the routines of running the establishment. Flora threw herself into learning everything, grateful for the distraction and eager to prove her worth. She helped Catherine prepare meals, clean rooms, manage accounts, and deal with the various personalities of the boarders. On Barrett's last evening before returning to his mountain home, he and Flora walked through the town as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. They strolled without any particular destination, just enjoying the cooling evening air and each other's company. "Your mother is wonderful," Flora said. "I already feel more at home here than I have anywhere in a long time." "She likes you too," Barrett replied. "She told me you have good sense and a strong work ethic. That's high praise from her." They walked in silence for a while. Then Flora gathered her courage and said, "I never properly thanked you for what you did for me. You saved me, Barrett. In every way a person can be saved." Barrett stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. "You saved yourself, Flora. I just gave you a ride." "It was more than that, and you know it," Flora insisted. "You gave me hope when I had none. You made me feel capable again. You treated me with more respect and kindness than anyone else in my life ever has." Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "I'm going to miss you when you leave." Something flickered in Barrett's eyes, an emotion Flora could not quite name. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His calloused fingers lingered against her cheek for just a moment. "I'll miss you too," he said, his deep voice rough with something that might have been longing. "More than I expected to miss anyone." Flora's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Will you come back to visit?" "I'll come back," Barrett promised. "I usually visit Mama a few times a year. Maybe I'll make those visits more frequent." He paused, then added carefully, "If that would be welcome." "It would be very welcome," Flora said softly. They stood there on the quiet street as darkness gathered around them, something unspoken but profound passing between them. Barrett's hand moved from her cheek to gently cup her jaw, his thumb brushing across her skin with heartbreaking tenderness. Flora found herself leaning into his touch, drawn to this powerful man who had shown her such unexpected gentleness. "It's too soon," Barrett said quietly, though he made no move to pull away. "You need time to heal from what Thomas did." "I know," Flora whispered, though part of her wanted to argue that what she felt for Barrett was entirely separate from anything she had felt for Thomas. "But you'll come back?" "I'll come back," Barrett repeated, and it sounded like a vow. He walked her back to the boarding house, said goodbye to his mother, and left before dawn the next morning. Flora watched from her window as he rode away, heading north toward his mountain home, and felt an ache in her chest that was entirely different from the pain of Thomas's betrayal. The weeks turned into months, and Flora settled into her new life in Silver City with surprising ease. She worked alongside Catherine, learning the intricacies of running a boarding house and discovering she had a talent for managing the business side of things. The boarders came to appreciate her efficiency and friendly manner, and Catherine began relying on her more and more for important decisions. Flora wrote to her father regularly, assuring him of her safety and happiness. His letters back were full of news from Lordsburg, though he carefully avoided mentioning Thomas or Violet. Flora found that she rarely thought of them anymore, the pain of their betrayal fading into something distant and almost unreal. What was real was the anticipation she felt knowing Barrett would return eventually. What was real was how her heart leaped every time she heard horses outside, hoping it might be him. What was real was how Catherine smiled knowingly whenever Flora asked casual questions about when Barrett might visit next. Summer had fully arrived when Barrett finally rode into Silver City again on a hot July afternoon. Flora was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard Catherine exclaim with delight, and she knew without being told that Barrett had returned. She wiped her hands on her apron with trembling fingers and walked out to the front porch. He stood in the dusty street holding his horse's reins, looking up at the boarding house with an expression that transformed the moment he saw Flora. His face broke into a smile that made him look younger, less weathered by solitude and the harsh mountain life. "Hello, Flora," he called up to her. "Hello, Barrett," she replied, unable to keep the joy from her voice. "Welcome back." He stayed for a week that time, ostensibly to help his mother with various projects around the boarding house, but Flora noticed how his eyes followed her as she worked, how he always seemed to find excuses to be in the same room. She caught herself doing the same thing, drawn to his quiet presence like a compass pointing north. On his fourth evening there, Barrett asked Flora to go riding with him. They rode out of town into the hills beyond, following a trail that led to a small lake reflecting the evening sky. Barrett had packed food for a simple picnic, and they sat by the water eating and talking as the sun set. "I've thought about you every day," Barrett said suddenly, setting down his plate and looking at Flora with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Up in the mountains, alone, I'd find myself remembering things you said, the way you laugh, how you looked that first morning learning to build a fire." Flora's heart raced. "I've thought about you too, constantly." Barrett moved closer, his large frame somehow both powerful and gentle as he reached for her hand. "I know it has not been very long since what happened with Thomas. And I know I'm not much of a catch, just a mountain man with rough manners and no prospects beyond a cabin in the wilderness. But Flora, I need you to know that I have fallen completely in love with you." Tears sprang to Flora's eyes, but they were happy tears this time. "Oh, Barrett, I love you too. I think I started falling for you during our journey here, though I was afraid to admit it even to myself." Barrett cupped her face with both his large hands, his expression reverent. "Are you sure? I don't want you agreeing to anything because you feel grateful or because I was there when you were hurting. You deserve more than that." "I'm sure," Flora said firmly. "What I feel for you is nothing like what I felt for Thomas. With him, it was all surface, all show. With you, everything is real and solid and true. You make me want to be brave. You make me feel strong. You see me clearly and you like what you see, and I've never experienced that before." Barrett searched her face for a long moment, then, slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned down and kissed her. It was gentle at first, almost tentative from such a powerful man, but when Flora responded by wrapping her arms around his neck and kissing him back, his arms came around her waist and pulled her closer. The kiss deepened, full of months of longing and the recognition of two souls finding their match. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Barrett rested his forehead against Flora's and said, "Marry me." Flora laughed, breathless and giddy. "Is that a question or a command?" "It's a plea," Barrett said seriously. "Marry me, Flora. Be my wife. Come live with me in the mountains, or I'll move to Silver City, or we'll figure out something in between. I don't care where we are as long as we're together." "Yes," Flora said without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you." They sealed the promise with another kiss, and then another, until the stars came out above them and the lake reflected the moon like liquid silver. They were married 6 weeks later in the small church in Silver City, with Catherine beaming in the front pew and Flora's father making the journey from Lordsburg to walk his daughter down the aisle. This time, Flora wore a simple blue dress and carried wildflowers Barrett had picked from the high country. This time, the groom stood at the altar with his heart in his eyes, watching his bride approach with an expression of such love and devotion that there was not a dry eye in the church. This time, everything was exactly as it should be. After the wedding, Barrett surprised Flora by presenting her with his solution to their living situation. He had spent the weeks before the wedding building an addition onto his mountain cabin, expanding it into a real home with multiple rooms and windows that would fill the space with light. But he had also purchased a small house in Silver City, close to his mother's boarding house. "We'll spend spring and summer in the mountains," Barrett explained, showing Flora the deed to the Silver City property. "Then come down for fall and winter so you can help Mama and we're not snowed in for months. That way you get the best of both worlds. And so do I." Flora threw her arms around his neck, overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness. "It's perfect. You're perfect." "Far from it," Barrett said, but he was grinning as he lifted her clear off her feet and spun her around. "But I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make you happy." They traveled to Barrett's mountain home for their honeymoon, and Flora fell in love with the high country just as she had fallen in love with the man who called it home. The cabin sat in a meadow surrounded by pine forests, with a crystal stream running nearby and mountains rising in every direction. The air was crisp and clean, scented with pine and wildflowers. Barrett had clearly worked hard on the expansion, and the cabin was now surprisingly comfortable with sturdy furniture he had built himself and windows that let in the mountain sunlight. He had even constructed a covered porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset paint the peaks in shades of pink and gold. Flora took to mountain life with the same determination she had brought to everything else. Barrett taught her to fish in the cold streams, to identify animal tracks, to shoot well enough to protect herself when he was away checking trap lines. She learned to preserve food for the winter, to tan hides, to read the weather in the clouds gathering around the peaks. But more than the skills, she learned what it meant to be truly married to someone who loved her completely. Barrett was attentive and passionate, gentle with his strength, always making sure she felt cherished and desired. He left her notes carved on pieces of bark when he went hunting, telling her he loved her in the simplest words. He brought her treasures from the forest, interesting rocks, perfect pine cones, the shed antler of an elk. He held her at night while they talked about everything and nothing, sharing dreams and fears and laughter. Flora had never been so happy. When fall arrived and they moved down to Silver City for the winter, Flora slipped back into helping Catherine with the boarding house, while Barrett took odd jobs around town and made himself useful. The townspeople grew accustomed to seeing the big mountain man walking hand in hand with his wife through the streets, his fierce exterior softened by obvious adoration every time he looked at her. Catherine delighted in having them both close, and the three of them often shared dinners filled with good food and easy conversation. Flora marveled at how her life had transformed so completely. A year ago, she had been preparing to marry a man who did not truly love her, settling for a comfortable life in a town where she would have slowly suffocated. Now she was married to a man who loved her deeply, living a life split between wilderness adventure and community involvement, challenged and fulfilled in ways she never could have imagined. News reached them occasionally from Lordsburg through Flora's father's letters. Thomas and Violet had apparently made it as far as Santa Fe before their relationship fell apart. Thomas had been caught cheating at cards and run out of town, and Violet had been forced to take work as a laundress to survive. Flora's father reported this not with satisfaction, but with sadness over how thoroughly Violet had destroyed her own future for a man who proved worthless. Flora tried to feel vindicated by this news, but found she mostly felt pity. Her sister's betrayal had been terrible, but it had inadvertently freed Flora to find real love with Barrett. In a strange way, Violet had done her a favor, though Flora knew she would never be able to forgive her sister for the cruelty of how it happened. "Do you think you'll ever want to see her again?" Barrett asked one evening when Flora mentioned her father's latest letter. They were sitting on the porch of their Silver City house, watching the stars emerge in the twilight sky. Flora considered the question carefully. Maybe someday, if she genuinely apologizes and shows real remorse. But not anytime soon. The wound is too fresh still, and I have no desire to let that kind of toxicity back into my life. She leaned against Barrett's solid shoulder. I'd rather focus on the future we're building than on the past that tried to break me. Barrett pressed a kiss to the top of her head. That seems wise to me. Their first winter together passed in comfortable domesticity. Flora became even more integral to running the boarding house, and Catherine began openly talking about eventually signing the business over to her and Barrett when she felt ready to retire. Flora discovered she had a talent for the hospitality business, making improvements that increased their occupancy and reputation. But when spring arrived and they returned to the mountains, Flora felt her spirit soar with the freedom of the high country. She loved both aspects of their life equally, the social engagement of town and the peaceful solitude of the wilderness. But there was something about the mountains that felt like coming home. It was in their second summer in the high country that Flora realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but when she finally told Barrett, his reaction exceeded all her expectations. He picked her up with a whoop of joy that echoed across the meadow, spinning her carefully before setting her down and dropping to his knees to press his ear against her still flat belly. "There's a baby in there," he said with such wonder that Flora started laughing even as tears streamed down her face. Our baby, Flora confirmed, running her fingers through his long hair as he knelt before her. "Are you happy?" Barrett looked up at her with an expression of such fierce joy and love that it took her breath away. Happy does not even begin to cover it. He became even more protective as her pregnancy progressed, insisting on doing all the heavy work himself and fretting whenever she so much as lifted a bucket of water. Flora found it endearing even when it became excessive, understanding that Barrett's protective nature was just another expression of his love. They came down from the mountains earlier that fall, Barrett wanting Flora near the doctor in Silver City for the remainder of her pregnancy. Catherine fussed over her almost as much as Barrett did, and Flora found herself surrounded by more love and care than she had ever experienced. Their son was born on a snowy January morning in 1880, entering the world with a lusty cry that announced his robust health. Barrett held him with hands that trembled despite their strength, his eyes wet with tears as he counted tiny fingers and toes. "He's perfect," Barrett whispered, looking from his son to Flora with awe. "You're amazing. Thank you for this gift." They named him Benjamin, and he proved to have inherited his father's robust constitution and his mother's curiosity about the world. As he grew from infant to toddler, he displayed an adventurous spirit that had both parents constantly vigilant to keep him out of trouble. Flora marveled at Barrett's transformation into fatherhood. The fierce mountain man became utterly soft when it came to his son, patiently teaching Benjamin about animals and plants and the natural world with the same care he had once used teaching Flora. Yet Barrett also maintained firm boundaries and expectations, raising their son to be respectful and responsible. When Benjamin was 2, Flora found herself pregnant again. Their daughter arrived in the spring of 1882, born in the mountain cabin surrounded by wildflowers blooming in the meadow. They named her Grace, and she proved to be a calm, observant child who studied the world with serious dark eyes before breaking into smiles that lit up her entire face. Barrett's love somehow expanded to encompass this new addition, and Flora often found him sitting on the porch with a child on each knee, telling them stories about animals or teaching them songs he remembered from his own childhood. Catherine remained active in the boarding house until she was nearly 60, at which point she officially signed the business over to Flora and Barrett and moved into a comfortable suite of rooms on the ground floor. She spent her days knitting, reading, and spoiling her grandchildren outrageously, living to the age of 73 before passing peacefully in her sleep with her family around her. Flora and Barrett mourned her deeply, but they also celebrated a life well lived and the legacy of kindness she had left behind. They continued running the boarding house with the same care and attention Catherine had modeled, making it one of the most respected establishments in Silver City. Through the years, Flora occasionally heard news about Thomas or Violet. Thomas had apparently drifted from town to town, never settling, always looking for an easy opportunity that never materialized. Violet had eventually married a rancher and seemed to have found some stability, though she never reached out to apologize or reconcile with Flora. Flora's father remained a constant presence in their lives, visiting regularly and delighting in his grandchildren. He never remarried after Flora's mother died, content with his freight business and his role as beloved grandfather. When he finally passed at the age of 71, Flora grieved deeply, but took comfort in knowing he had lived to see her happy and settled with a family who loved her. Benjamin grew into a young man who shared his father's love of the wilderness, eventually establishing his own homestead further north in the mountains. Grace proved to have her mother's head for business and her father's steady nature, taking over more and more of the boarding house operations as Flora and Barrett aged. Flora and Barrett added 2 more children to their family over the years, another son they named Thomas after Flora's father, and a daughter they named Catherine after Barrett's mother. Their mountain cabin had to be expanded repeatedly to accommodate the growing family, until it was less a cabin and more a sprawling homestead with multiple buildings. The pattern of their lives continued, spending warm months in the mountains and cold months in Silver City, their children growing up equally comfortable in wilderness and town. Flora taught all of them to read and cipher, while Barrett taught them wilderness skills and self-reliance. Together, they raised a family grounded in love, respect, and the understanding that home was wherever they were together. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Barrett surprised Flora by taking her back to the lake where he had first told her he loved her. They left the children with Grace, who was now 17 and perfectly capable of managing her younger siblings, and rode out into the hills on a beautiful September evening. The lake looked exactly as it had 2 decades earlier, still reflecting the sunset sky like a mirror. They sat in the same spot where Barrett had proposed, and Flora marveled at how much had changed since that evening, while the fundamental truth remained the same. She loved this man with her whole heart. "Do you have any regrets?" Barrett asked, echoing a question he had asked her years ago when they first met. Flora looked at her husband, his hair now streaked with silver, but his strength still evident in his broad shoulders and capable hands. She thought about the life they had built together, the children they had raised, the adventures they had shared, and the quiet moments of contentment. "Not a single one," she said truthfully. "Thomas and Violet did me the biggest favor of my life when they ran off together, though they certainly did not mean to. If they had not, I never would have been crying in that church. You never would have found me. We never would have had this extraordinary life together." Barrett pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her in the embrace that had become as familiar as breathing over their 20 years together. "I walked into that church that morning not expecting anything more than maybe helping a stranger in distress. I walked out having found the other half of my soul." "The best surprises are the ones we never see coming," Flora said, tilting her face up for the kiss she knew was coming. Barrett obliged, kissing her with all the passion and tenderness that had characterized their marriage from the beginning. When they finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers and said the same words he said every night before they fell asleep. "I love you, Flora Quinn." "I love you too, Barrett Quinn," she replied, as she always did, "today, tomorrow, and forever." They sat by the lake until the stars emerged, holding each other and watching the night sky unfold above them. The mountain man and the woman he had found, crying in a church, had built a love story that exceeded anything either of them could have imagined, proving that sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead directly to the best ones, and the right person can appear exactly when we need them most. As they rode back to Silver City in the moonlight, Flora thought about the girl she had been on her failed wedding day, destroyed by betrayal and unable to imagine a future worth living. She wished she could go back and tell that girl what was waiting for her just beyond the pain, a love so deep and true it would redefine everything she thought she knew about happiness, a partnership built on respect and passion and unwavering commitment, a family that would fill her days with purpose and joy, a life split between two worlds, both of which felt like home because home was wherever Barrett was. The years continued to pass, bringing both challenges and blessings as all years do. Barrett and Flora weathered droughts that tested their mountain homestead, harsh winters that kept them close to the fire, economic downturns that affected the boarding house business. But they faced everything together, their bond growing stronger with each trial overcome. Their children grew into adults who made them proud, each finding their own path while maintaining the values Barrett and Flora had instilled. Benjamin brought a wife home to meet his parents, a practical woman named Sarah who took to mountain life immediately. Grace eventually married a banker from Silver City, a good man who appreciated her sharp mind and tireless work ethic. Young Thomas became a school teacher, committed to educating the next generation. Catherine, their youngest, inherited her father's wanderlust and traveled throughout the territory before eventually settling in Arizona with a rancher she met during her adventures. Flora and Barrett became grandparents, then great-grandparents, their legacy spreading through the territory in the form of children and grandchildren who carried forward their values of hard work, integrity, and fierce loyalty to family. The boarding house remained in the family for generations, and the mountain homestead became a gathering place where descendants came to reconnect with their roots and hear stories about the legendary mountain man and the woman he had rescued from a church on her failed wedding day. In their later years, when Barrett's joints grew stiff from decades of hard mountain living and Flora's eyes began to fail from countless hours keeping accounts by lamplight, they finally surrendered the constant travel between town and mountains. They kept the Silver City house and let Benjamin take over the mountain homestead, though they visited whenever weather and health permitted. They spent their final years in comfortable companionship, sitting on their porch watching Silver City grow and change around them. Barrett still held Flora's hand like a young man courting his sweetheart, and Flora still felt her heart skip when he walked into a room. The passion of their early years had mellowed into something even deeper, a love so thoroughly integrated into every aspect of their lives that they moved together like one person inhabiting two bodies. Barrett was 72 when his heart finally gave out, sitting in his favorite chair on the porch with Flora beside him. One moment he was pointing out a hawk circling overhead, the next He squeezed Flora's hand and said, "I love you." And then he was gone, slipping away as peacefully as his mother had years before. Flora grieved deeply, but without regret. They had been married for 47 years, and not one of those years had been wasted. She had loved and been loved in return with an intensity and devotion that most people never experienced. Barrett had kept every promise he had ever made to her, had treated her like a queen every day of their marriage, had given her a life beyond anything she could have imagined that terrible morning in the Lordsburg church. She lived another 3 years after Barrett passed, surrounded by children and grandchildren who made sure she was never alone unless she wanted to be. She spent her final days in the Silver City house filled with memories, looking at the photographs that lined the walls documenting their extraordinary journey together. On a warm spring morning in 1926, with her youngest daughter Catherine holding her hand, Flora closed her eyes for the last time and slipped away to wherever Barrett was waiting. Her final words were, "Tell him I'm coming home." The funeral was attended by what seemed like half the territory, descendants and friends and people whose lives had been touched by Flora and Barrett's kindness over the decades. They buried her next to Barrett in the Silver City Cemetery under a simple headstone that read, "Barrett Quinn and Flora Quinn, together in love, united in eternity." The boarding house continued to operate under family management for another 50 years before finally being sold, though the new owners kept the name Quinn's Boarding House in honor of the family who had made it an institution. The mountain homestead remained in family hands, passed down through generations who kept alive the stories of the man who had built it and the woman he had loved there. And in Silver City, old-timers still told the story of the mountain man who had wandered into a church one April morning and found a woman crying at the altar because her groom had run off with her sister. They told how he had offered her a chance at a new life, how she had been brave enough to take it, and how that simple act of kindness on a terrible day had blossomed into one of the greatest love stories the territory had ever known. Because sometimes the worst betrayal leads directly to the truest love. Sometimes a stranger becomes the answer to prayers you did not know you were praying. Sometimes walking away from everything familiar is the only way to find where you truly belong. And sometimes a mountain man walks into a church at exactly the right moment and changes everything. Flora and Barrett's story became the kind of legend that parents told their children when they wanted to illustrate what real love looked like. The kind of partnership where two people made each other stronger and better, where commitment was absolute and devotion was unshakable. It was a reminder that happy endings were possible even after the darkest beginnings, and that the right person was worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth building a whole life around. Their great-great-grandchildren still visited both the house in Silver City and the homestead in the mountains, still felt the presence of the love that had built these places and sustained the family through generations. They heard the stories and understood that they came from a legacy of strength, resilience, and most importantly, a love that had transcended every obstacle and endured beyond death itself. In the end, Thomas and Violet had done Flora the greatest favor of her life, though it took years for her to see it that way. Their betrayal had freed her to find Barrett, and Barrett had shown her what love was supposed to feel like. Not pretty words and empty promises, but solid devotion and daily choice to put each other first. Not surface charm, but deep understanding and unwavering support. The story of Flora and Barrett became proof that endings could also be beginnings, that pain could transform into joy, and that sometimes the person you are meant to spend your life with shows up exactly when you need them most, in the form of a mountain man with kind eyes who walks into a church and offers a weeping woman hope for a future she cannot yet imagine. It was a story worth telling and retelling, worth remembering and celebrating, a testament to the power of love to heal wounds, build families, and create legacies that endured long after the lovers themselves had passed into memory and legend. And it all started with a betrayal, a church, and a mountain man who chose kindness when he could have simply walked away, setting in motion a love story that would echo through generations and remind everyone who heard it that true love really did exist, and it was worth waiting for.